Well, I want to express my deep appreciation to the Emeritus College and to Gretchen in particular. It's an interesting story to talk about the Emory Unit for many different reasons. But I think to begin with, it's important to talk a little bit about the context of the times. It's 100 years ago. America's entry into the Great War, April 6, 1917. As most of us know, if you've studied history, World War I began in August 1914 with the war breaking out in Europe, and it's one of the most complicated historical catastrophes I can think of. I base my knowledge in large part on Barbara Tuchman's Pulitzer Prize-winning book, The Guns of August. You read that book, you understand how we stumbled into this war that we still feel the ramifications of a century later. May 7th, 1915, the sinking of the Lusitania, 128 Americans die, torpedoed by a German submarine, and that enhances the tensions between the United States and Germany, but it doesn't yet lead to war. It was, in fact, in 1916, President Wilson runs for re-election on a campaign of "he keeps us out of war." There was a lot of isolationism in the United States that they wanted nothing to do with the European war. So Wilson runs on that slogan, wins re-election in 1916. But in 1917, we began to see greater provocations by the Germans, more attacks on U.S. merchant shipping, provocations of another kind, some of them, the Zimmerman telegram, for example, where Germany offers to support Mexico in an effort to retake Texas. Figure that out. But that was all leading up to America finally reaching the breaking point. And April 2nd, 1917, President Wilson goes to Congress, calls for a declaration of war against Germany. Congress passes that 4 days later, April 6, 1917. In Wilson's war message, he talks about the United States engaging in the war to make the world safe for democracy. Now, interestingly enough, America enters this war totally unprepared, absolutely unprepared for modern war. It's interesting to speculate or to realize that there were fewer than 300,000 soldiers, sailors, and Marines in the military in 1917. There had been no standing army of any notable size since 1865. It's 52 years earlier. The most recent military action that the U.S. Army was engaged in was chasing Pancho Villa around Arizona and back into Mexico. So that was our major military engagement. But the president calls for 1,200,000 military recruits. So now you've got to gear up for a mobilization of American manpower to meet the needs of modern war. He appoints General John J. Blackjack Pershing, who had been the leader of the chasing of Pancho Villa back into Mexico, to be the head of the not yet existent American Expeditionary Force. And in his memoir, My Experiences in the World War, Pershing talks about where the United States was at that particular point in time. He says, we had made small preparations for defense and none for aggression. We basically were of the opinion that the Atlantic Ocean, the Pacific Ocean protected us from enemies. So we had no reason to keep a large standing army. So consequently, we were not prepared. Pershing, the photograph at the bottom, he arrives in France in June 1917. There's a famous quote where he's allegedly said, Lafayette nous voici, means Lafayette, we are here. He never said that. But one of his senior generals did. So they always attribute it to Pershing, but he did not say it. And the famous Montgomery flag recruiting poster that we have all seen through the years. I want you for the U.S. Army, Uncle Sam, pointing a stern finger at you. But the challenges in building an American Expeditionary Force, it was monumental. Again, because we had such a small military, we had to build it from scratch and deal with shortages. We had no modern military equipment to speak of. We did not have the weapons, certainly not the kinds of weapons that were currently being used in the war in Europe. We had no reason to expend the resources to do that, as well as the materials that were going to be needed to support and transport a military across the ocean. It was going to take months and months for the American industry to retool to begin to build out the resources necessary to outfit and equip an expeditionary force to Europe. And as I mentioned, the military had not kept up with modern warfare and technology. In 1914, Army had no tanks. There were a grand total of 23 airplanes in our Army Air Corps. All of them were reconnaissance planes. Not a single fighter plane did the American Army Air Corps have at that time. And because of prior commitments, many of the troop ships and transport ships that were going to be needed to get men and resources across the ocean had prior commitments for commercial purposes. So they had to be negotiated with to be able to say, okay, we're going to shift from commercial transport to military transport. All of this took enormous amounts of energy and time to be able to accomplish that. Interesting photograph, the top picture is machine gun training, again, using probably French or British made machine guns, because I'm not certain how many we had at that time, but men learning how to use them. And then this bottom photograph is infantry training at Chickamauga Battlefield. You may not be aware that at this particular time, Chickamauga, Gettysburg, Shiloh, Vicksburg were all national military parks under the direction and supervision of the War Department, and they were used as military training grounds. So these large spaces like Chickamauga were used for infantry training. And in fact, at Chickamauga, there was an airport. There was an airplane field for practicing with aircraft. So it's hard to envision that when you go to Chickamauga today and you see the Civil War battlefield, that it was in fact an infantry training ground in 1917. An interesting aspect to America's entry in the First World War, besides the fact that we were not prepared to enter the war, it was going to be months and months and months before American troops in any large number would actually make it to France. One of the things that I learned in reading the 2-volume Pershing memoir, My Experiences in the World War, was that he spent the enormous amount of his time in France fighting with, not the Germans, he's fighting with the French and the English. Because basically they wanted American troops to come in and simply be replacements for the British and French casualties and go into the trenches fighting under British and French flags. And he said, we are not doing that. He was absolutely opposed to the piecemeal insertion of American soldiers into the fight. He also was a staunch opponent of trench warfare. He saw trench warfare as suicide. It was, as he described in his book, that neither side in trench warfare had the strength to dislodge the other. So consequently, it was a stalemate, and it was a siege warfare, which was intended simply to slaughter tens of thousands of soldiers. If you've seen some of the films recently, the one I watched recently was the They Shall Not Grow Old. The powerful documentary and the remastering and the colorization of the films, the Battle of the Somme, you realize how brutal and how horrible trench warfare was. And Pershing said, that's not the kind of war we're going to fight. We're going to fight an active, aggressive war. We're going to move forward constantly. We're not going into trenches. We're going to move forward. But he needed to have the troops in order to do that. And so he had to wait, again, for the training, the mobilization, the equipping, to begin to get American soldiers over to France. So it really wasn't, think about this, we declare war April 1917. The first troops arrive and enter combat in any number, May 1918, 1 full year after we declare war. That's how long it took to get us ready to go over. And that was when the troops entered as a unified force, May and June 1918, at the Battle of Belleau Wood and Chateau-Thierry. Those were the 2 major initial engagements of US troops in World War I. As we got more troops over there, Germany recognized quite early on, because of the industrial might of the United States, that once we got fully engaged, they likely could not win the war. So they had enormous efforts to try to win the war, beat the French and the British before we got there. And ultimately, what it led to was the decisive turning point of the war was in the fall of 1918, the Meuse-Argonne Offensive. It's interesting to look at because we hear about Chickamauga, we hear about Gettysburg, we hear about the Battle of the Bulge. The Meuse-Argonne Offensive was the bloodiest military engagement in American history. From beginning in the middle of September till the declaration of the armistice, November 11th, 1918, there were 1 million United States soldiers engaged, either on the front lines or in support. There were 26,000 American soldiers killed and more than 120,000 wounded over the course of this one engagement. But it was the decisive battle that won the war for the Allies. It decimated the German army and forced them into the armistice. The photograph at the top right, it's a famous photograph of Marines at Belleau Wood, May 1918. The bottom photograph is American tanks going into action in the Meuse-Argonne Offensive in September 1918. It should be pointed out that the Americans are going into battle in tanks that were made by the French. We didn't have any tanks. We had to use French tanks because we had not built and constructed our own tanks at that point. So it was the monumental, decisive action of the First World War. So what about mobilizing medical care for the doughboys? In 1917, there was only a small number of medical reserve officers in the United States military, physicians who were on duty during the war. There was no medical department as you might envision it today. There was an Army Nurse Corps with registered nurses, and there was what they called a sanitary corps, which was medics, ambulance transport, but no cohesive, coherent, comprehensive medical department for the US military. So that had to be dealt with, and the fact that we're now mobilizing over 1 million young men to go overseas, but we don't have a medical structure in place to take care of them once they get there. And so the Army Surgeon General, William Gorgas, reached out to the Red Cross and said, what we need to do, since we have to mobilize so quickly and get moving forward, is we will call on the medical schools and the major hospitals around the country to organize medical units for deployment overseas. So William Elkin, dean of the newly established Emory University School of Medicine, who's pictured down here at the bottom left, he's asked to form a medical unit. So when he receives that request, he turns to Dr. E.C. Davis, who had been a military surgeon in previous years, to organize the medical unit. And so that was the impetus or the genesis of the Emory unit. And this is a Red Cross poster used to, and again, the Red Cross and the Army working together to make this happen. Dr. Davis, born Albany, Georgia, December 11th, 1867. His father was a surgeon in the Confederate Army, but his father died when he was 5 years old after fording the Flint River to take care of a patient contracting pneumonia. He graduated from the University of Georgia, 1888, University of Louisville Medical School. I don't know why he went to Louisville versus going to Medical College of Georgia or someplace closer to home. I've always wondered why he went off to Louisville, but it might have been for some reason I do not know. And he moved to Atlanta in 1894, and he opened up an office in 1897 in the new English American building, which we now call the Flatiron Building. That was his first medical office in Atlanta. As I mentioned, 1898-99, he served as a military surgeon in the Spanish-American War. He was deployed to Tampa, Florida, where they had a large hospital complex there. He did not make it to Cuba or to the Philippines. The hospital was in Tampa. Afterwards, he taught at the Atlanta School of Medicine, one of the predecessors of Emory. 1908, with Dr. Luther Fisher, he opened the Davis Fisher Sanatorium, which was rededicated Crawford W. Long Memorial Hospital in 1931, and now is Emory University Hospital, Midtown. Now, organizing the Emory unit, one of the things that Dr. Davis, because of his contacts across Atlanta and across Georgia, he was able to reach out and recruit prominent physicians from the Atlanta hospitals, the Atlanta area, and across Georgia, as well as reaching out to people in other states to join the unit, also doing the same with nurses at the Davis Fisher Sanatorium, at St. Joseph's, at Georgia Baptist, at Grady, the hospitals that were in existence at the time, recruiting nurses to join the Emory Unit. The original plan was for a 500-bed hospital to be funded through local subscription, as well as $40,000 in federal funds. Interesting, an additional $7,000 was raised through a newspaper campaign, fundraising campaign, that was used to buy an ambulance. So they had their own personal ambulance to take overseas with them. August 30th, 1917, the unit is officially designated as Base Hospital 43. And you can go online and you can get a listing of all of the base hospitals and all of the other hospitals. And you can see what different universities and different major medical centers were the sponsors of these different hospitals that were deployed to France. So it was University of Virginia, University of Pennsylvania, and so on and so forth that deployed medical units overseas. It took months to fill out the staff, not just the physicians and the nurses, but you've got to fill out enlisted men and others that were going to be supporting this unit, doing all the other tasks that a hospital would require. And oftentimes they would recruit men and they would get drafted and be sent off. And so they had to start over again. It was months and months of what you might describe, if you've been in the military, is hurry up and wait. Waiting and waiting for orders to come. Finally, in April 1918, they get the orders to report to Camp John B. Gordon, which was a massive, massive training base. It's on the site of Peachtree DeKalb Airport is today. And this is actually, there's a little cutout there of the state historical marker at Camp Gordon. It was the training ground for the 82nd Division, known as the Rainbow Division. If you're familiar with World War I history, that's where Alvin York trained. Sergeant Alvin York was the most decorated soldier in the First World War. Some of us may have seen the movie where Gary Cooper portrayed Alvin York. It made in 1941, but he trained at Camp Gordon. And so did Base Hospital 43, and that's mentioned in the state historical marker. The photograph at the bottom is part of and this will be out on display afterward, but this was basically the panoramic photograph of the physicians and nurses of the Emory Unit taken at Camp Gordon in 1918. And you can see Dr. Davis, and you can see some others that I recognize in the photograph as they were in training for deployment overseas. And there was a lot of, again, encouragement, support, cheering, urging on of this group to go overseas. Cora Harris, who was a journalist for the Atlanta newspapers, wrote in one of her columns that every doctor and nurse that can be spared must be sent to France. So there was a lot of cheering to get these folks motivated to get ready to go overseas. Now, Emory Care over there. June 2nd, 1918, the unit boarded the RMS Olympic. I don't know if that made them nervous because that was the sister ship of the Titanic. But there's a picture of the Olympic in its World War I camouflage. They took that boat over to England, and then they took a smaller boat over to Le Havre, France, and then took a train to Blois, which is the city in France where the base hospital would be located. July 3rd, 1918, Base Hospital 43 is operational, occupying several buildings in Blois. Because of the scope of the facilities, they not only had to use what might have been a local hospital building, but they had to adopt and adapt other buildings to serve as the hospital because as it grew. So they used convents, they used school buildings, they used other local buildings in Blois for the purpose of building out the physical needs that the hospital would require. At the time that they began operation, the capacity increased from the 500 that had really initially been called for to 939 beds. and 1,229 emergency beds. So we're up to 2,000 plus beds already. July 7th, the two principal surgical teams are organized. One was led by Dr. Davis, the other by Dr. Charles Dowman. And I can remember Dr. Charles Dowman Jr., who was his son, who was a neurosurgeon at Crawford Long. I'm sure John does too very well. August 15th, the census tops 1,000 patients, composed of gunshot and shrapnel victims, gas casualties, and other illnesses. And the hospital expands repeatedly to care for the rapidly increasing patient load. Fall 1918, during the climactic Meuse-Argonne offensive, the hospital capacity significantly expanded as casualties, including Germans, were brought directly from the front. And you can see in the bottom left, this came from the unit history book, and it shows some of the buildings in Blois that had been adapted for use by the hospital, the church buildings, community halls, and the like. Now, the American Expeditionary Force medical system was a four-tiered system, and it was adapted from what the French and the British called their Escalon System. The first tier was the aid and dressing stations, which would have been right behind the front line. So when you were injured, wounded, you would be taken by a litter bearer from the front line right to the aid stations and the dressing stations within, a few hundred yards of the front line. And there you would be initially assessed and determined whether or not the wound was minor, in which case they might patch you up and send you back up to the front. But if your wound was more serious, then you would then be sent back 2 to 4 miles behind the front line to the field hospitals. I tend to think of the field hospitals as kind of what we think about in MASH, the MASH hospitals, where you're doing emergency surgeries, you're doing some of the life-saving things to try to keep these people alive to see if you can help them further. The less seriously wounded would be treated and returned to duty. The others would be sent to evacuation hospitals. So here's the aid stations. Here are the field hospitals. And they might actually have been segregated. You got gas victims, surgical, sick. So they might actually segregate the patients depending upon the type of treatment they might require. So those are the first two tiers of the four-tiered system. Then you went to the third tier, which were the evacuation hospitals. These were 5 to 10 miles behind the front line. So if you got past the aid station, you got past the evacuation or the field hospital, you then went to the evacuation hospitals. These were near railroad depots, close to the trains. Medical and surgical teams would care for the patients who may respond quickly to treatment. Again, the seriously wounded would then be referred on to the base hospitals. So here are your evacuation hospitals, 5 to 10 miles behind the front line. Here is the railroad connection. And then you would go to the base hospitals. It's with 30 to 100 miles behind the front lines. These were connected by rail, and these were the care for the most complex cases requiring extensive surgery and lengthy recovery. So here are the base hospitals, well away from the front lines to have that extended care that these patients might require. This is a photograph of a patient's soldiers being loaded into the ambulances for transport, probably to an evacuation hospital with my summarization, my idea of probably where that was taken. So those were the four tiers of the system. Base Hospital 43 obviously was one of these base hospitals that required that the patients would arrive, that required extensive surgical treatment and convalescence. Base Hospital 43's accomplishments. At the conclusion of the war, they had 2,237 patients under their care. From July to November 1918, they treated 2,500 soldiers with gunshot wounds, 513 with simple or compound fractures, 714 poison gas casualties, 1,034 influenza patients. And this is a photograph of an influenza ward. And again, there's no private rooms. You are in a large open space. You might have a cubicle curtain between patients, but you can imagine the challenges that they were facing to how to avoid the spread of contagious disease. But that was one of the types of patients. 6,500 patients with other illnesses, a total of 9,000 patients, and remarkably, only 102 deaths, which to me is just astonishing when you think about the nature of medicine at that period of time. And again, patients have been in wards together. So the spread of disease would have been so easy to be a challenge. Christmas 1918, again, after the armistice, the unit received a citation for its dedicated service from General Pershing. Returning home to Atlanta. March 26, 1919, Emory Unit personnel arrived in the United States and board trains for the journey home. March 29, 1919, the unit is greeted by large crowds at Camp Gordon. Happy to see him home. And then a couple of days later, there's a reception held for the unit at the Piedmont Driving Club. How nice is that? And then the next day, the Emory Unit is demobilized. And this is an excerpt from a newspaper article, Emory Unit given a rousing welcome, horrors of war forgotten with loved ones near. And then this is a quote from one of the patients of the Emory Unit Hospital, Base Hospital 43. He said, "Atlanta, you can be proud of the Emory Unit, and if you have any more like it, send them along, but you have to go some to keep up with Emory. God bless, from a Northern Yank, Lieutenant E.H. Jeffries from New York." And Mayor James Key at the reception was quoted as saying, "Atlanta is proud of you, is glad that you are back, and wishes to each of you health and prosperity." So from mobilization to demobilization was, a little more than a year and a half, and only about 6-7 months overseas in France. A few notable members of the Emory Unit, and then I had to call these from the dozens and dozens, but these may be names that might be familiar to you. Dr. F. Kells Boland, senior surgeon. He was the author of the book, The First Anesthetic, a profile of the life of Dr. Crawford Long. It was he who was so instrumental in getting the placement of the statue of Dr. Long in Statuary Hall in the United States Capitol. Interesting little side story. The other person, each state is allowed 2 people to be celebrated as the representatives of that state in Statuary Hall in the U.S. Capitol. Dr. Long was one of them. The other one was Alexander Stephens, who had been a congressman, a friend of Abraham Lincoln's, and then later become Georgia governor, vice president of the Confederacy. But what's interesting is I think that Long and Stephens are also the only 2 that were college roommates that are featured in Statuary Hall. Figure that out. Dr. Cyrus Strickler, senior surgeon, and he took over medical command of the unit when Dr. Davis had the invalid home in early 1919. Again, some of you may remember his son, Dr. Cy Strickler Jr., that was a physician here in Atlanta for many years. Dr. Murdoch Equin, he was an ENT surgeon, and from the 1930s to the 1960s, he was the physician for Georgia Tech football. So you would often hear his name called at Georgia Tech football games. He operated the Ponce de Leon Infirmary, which was right there on Ponce de Leon between Crawford Long and Mary Mac's tea room for many, many years, a little white frame building. But he was a renowned ear, nose, and throat surgeon in Atlanta for many, many years. Possibly the highlight of his surgical career was taking my tonsils out when I was 6. Dr. Alan Bunce, internal medicine. He was the chief of the base hospital laboratory at the base hospital 43. Interestingly enough, a little family thing, my father joined his practice when my father got out of the Navy in 1946, and he had his office on Courier Street, just a few blocks from between Crawford Long and Georgia Baptist. The building is still there. It was the Edward Gay House. It was a residence that had been converted to medical offices. And Gretchen mentioned Oakland Cemetery. Dr. Bunce is buried at Oakland. Dr. Charles Dowman, you've heard me mention him before. His son was a renowned neurosurgeon here in Atlanta for many, many years. Dr. Camille OBrien, she was a nurse, Army Nurse Corps. She was the only unit casualty in France in 18, and you'll hear about her a little bit more in a few minutes. She died of spinal meningitis in 1919. And there is a plaque at Emory Hospital that honors her memory. And that was recently restored in honor of her. Sinclair Jacobs, he was a unit pharmacist and the son of Joseph Jacobs, who, if you live in Atlanta long enough, you may remember Jacobs drugstores. Well, Dr. Joe Jacobs, his father, did his apprenticeship in pharmacy as a teenager under Dr. Crawford Long in Athens, Georgia, Dr. Long's medical office and apothecary. And he was interested enough that Dr. Long encouraged him to go seek a profession, a career in pharmacy. He went off to Philadelphia to pharmacy school, came back and opened up Jacobs Drugstore at 5 Points in downtown Atlanta, and ultimately had a chain of drugstores. But it was at his drugstore in downtown Atlanta in 1886 that the soda fountain run by Willis Venable mistakenly mixed carbonated water with this headache syrup called Coca-Cola instead of plain water, and the rest is retailing history. He too is buried at Oakland Cemetery in the family plot with his beautiful mausoleum where his father and his mother are interred. And then finally, Joel C. Harris was a quartermaster with the Emory Unit. That name may sound familiar. His father was Joel Chandler Harris. And he went on to become a newspaper journalist, and he was the son of Joel Chandler Harris, and he was born at the Wren's Nest. So that's just a few of the notable folks that were part of the Emory Unit. Now, what about the medical advances that took place during the First World War? As we note, the Great War saw mass killing on a scale never before seen in American history. The Battle of the Somme all by itself was 1 million casualties. I mean, it's just, the numbers are astonishing, the brutality of it. And as often is the case, desperate needs led to dramatic medical advances. So a few of those included motorized ambulance and railroad transport, which allowed the patients to be transported to medical care, surgical care, more quickly from the front than in prior wars. So that, again, enhanced survivability of their injuries. The organized triage systems that we talked about and you saw in the triage system, where there was an effort to identify those patients that could most benefit from the immediate treatment that would be required to keep them alive. Antiseptics and disinfection of wounds led to dramatic reduction in infections and subsequent amputations. In prior wars, an infection might lead to the amputation of an arm or a leg before the infection got all the way up into the main part of the body. But now with some of the disinfection techniques and use of antiseptics, they could reduce the numbers of amputations that were required. And interestingly, the widespread use of portable X-ray vehicles, this is something I did not know about until I began researching this, developed by Marie Curie. These were the French soldiers called them petite curies, but they were vehicles that had X-ray machines in them that could go toward the front, close to the field hospitals, where they could X-ray wounded soldiers to figure out how badly broken is the arm, where's the shrapnel in the body. So it was able to aid in the diagnosis and treatment of these patients. So these were these petite curies that were used by the military in order to enhance diagnosis and treatment of the casualties. Interestingly, too, this is an interesting quote. Mary M. Crawford, the only American female physician to serve in Europe during World War I, she was quoted as saying, and I think there's a lot of truth to it, is that a war benefits medicine more than it benefits everybody else. It's terrible, of course, but it does, because it forces to innovation. It forces advances. It forces innovation. Some additional advances: dramatic advances in plastic and reconstructive surgery and surgical anesthesia. Because of the types of wounds, and people are surviving serious wounds that might require subsequent plastic surgery. So it helped to advance the techniques in plastic surgery. There were technical advances in prosthetics. Walter Reed Hospital had an artificial limb laboratory where they were developing, experimenting with different types of prosthetics for those people that would lose an arm or a leg, could then have a prosthetic that might at least allow them some limited ability to use the prosthetic for the purposes of returning to a normal life to some degree. Advances in use of vaccines that would reduce the spread of contagious diseases. So that was another advance that came out of the war, during the war. Advances in blood typing, transfusion, and preservation of donated blood. Refrigeration of blood was one of the things that they were able to do, that allowed the people to be able to access and utilize donated blood and store it for longer periods of time to make it more readily available for the wounded soldiers that would need blood transfusions. And also, very early understanding of psychological injuries. In World War I, they called it shell shock. And these guys that had been in the trenches for weeks and weeks and weeks, and it's just that the psychological injury to them was phenomenal. World War II, they called it combat fatigue. And many of the symptoms would be the same: the inability to concentrate, the fear of sounds and noises, and on and on and on. And then, of course, now today we know it as, PTSD. So it really began to show up in terms of being a clinical concern with World War I and the psychological injuries. This is a photograph of a base hospital operating room, blood transfusion taking place, and of course the Lynn lab. Now, what about the Emory Unit in World War II? It mobilized in late 1941. The medical school dean at the time was Dr. Daniel Elkin, who was the nephew of Dr. William Elkin, so it was kind of like a family business. And he, along with Dr. Ira Ferguson, some of you may remember Dr. Ferguson, but they began recruiting physicians and nurses for military medical service. Summer of 1942, the unit was mobilized. I thought it was interesting that it went from base hospital 43, now it's the 43rd General Hospital. So they got to kind of keep a part of the name as they went forward. It served with distinction in North Africa, Italy, and France from 1943 to 45, treated more than 25,000 patients during their time in service. Here's a photograph of some of the physicians from the unit: Dr. Bryant, Dr. Harpole, Dr. Martin, Dr. Ferguson, and Dr. J.D. Martin. And I remember Dr. J.D. Martin after he had retired, and I've got a copy of his history of surgery at Emory at home that he autographed. I'm sure some of you also remember Dr. J.D. Martin when he was, I think, chief of surgery, the Department of Surgery at Emory Medical School. So a long-time surgeon here at Emory. This is the copy, this is a photograph, excuse me, of the 43rd General Hospital in Aix-en-Provence in France, 1944. Actually, it served previously as a German hospital. So once we kicked them out, we took it over. And here's a picture of the Emory, some of the Emory unit staff getting ready to go overseas in 1943. Hopefully this will work. This is a short embedded video that was put together by Emory, and I mentioned Camille OBrien, so hopefully this will work and you'll be able to hear it.
When America entered the First World War in 1917, dozens of medical professionals from Atlanta volunteered for duty. Because so many of them were affiliated with Emory University, the group became known as the Emory Unit. In 1918, after several weeks of training, the complement traveled to Blois, France, where they formed a hospital. There they tended the wounded for the remainder and immediately following the war. Ren Davis is grandson to Lieutenant Colonel Edward Davis.
He had been a surgeon in the Spanish-American War as an Army surgeon, and then had retained his military affiliation as a surgeon for the Georgia militia. So when America entered the First World War, the dean of the medical school turned to him and said, basically, on your experience, would you organize the Emory Unit?
Dr. Davis was also co-founder of Davis Fisher Sanatorium, which later became Crawford Long Hospital and today is Emory University Hospital Midtown. Among the dozens of nurses to serve under Davis was 34-year-old Camille Louise OBrien.
She was an older sister to my grandmother.
Nurse O'Brien would be the only member of the unit to die in France during the deployment. Her Her story had been largely forgotten until her grandnephew, William Cawthon, asked local historian Michael Hitt to find a suitable place to house her few remaining belongings he had been storing in his attic.
And Michael took the bone in his teeth and ran with it.
Hitt enlisted the Atlanta History Center to care for her remaining artifacts, like this letter penned by the unit's chief nurse 2 days after O'Brien's death in April 1919 from spinal meningitis.
Dear Miss Harbin, I feel it my duty to write you in regard to the death of your sister Camille OBrien. On the afternoon of April 2nd, she complained of feeling badly, but as I have always found her unselfish, uncomplaining, and never wanting to put anyone to trouble, she scoffed at the idea of having a doctor see her.
Over to seas they go.
Hitt also discovered that although Camille OBrien had initially been buried in France, she had later been exhumed and brought back to Atlanta, where she was buried here in Greenwood Cemetery in 1921.
So I assumed, because of the picture that I have of the grave in France, that she was still over there. And I did not know that she was brought back here in 1921 until Michael found out.
That's when I discovered she had no headstone. And with what I already had, I figured, you know, this can't stand. I mean, this has to change.
And change it did. Hitt helped organize this gravesite remembrance 100 years to the day after her death, to honor the nurse who gave so much to serve her patients.
She's a symbol of what we all should strive to be. We put our patients first.
She was one of the most beloved nurses in the unit and very devoted to her work.
So that's my story, and I'll stick to it. I'll be delighted to answer any questions. I'll make one other point too as you're doing that, and that is that a lot of the documents and the official records of the Emory Unit are in Emory Special Collections. So when I was doing the history of Crawford Long Hospital, I was looking at a lot of the original documents for the unit. Yes, ma'am.
Okay, I have one really quick question. I thought I wrote down that there were 2 Emory casualties.
There was one before they deployed overseas.
Okay, thank you. The other thing has to do with African-American soldiers. They were not being treated in the unit, right?
There is some reference to some African-American soldiers that were treated in the base hospitals, but the quantity and numbers, oftentimes many of the African-American soldiers that went overseas would have been in segregated units. They were behind the lines. There were only so many that actually were in actual combat. So it's hard to ascertain an answer to that question specifically. I don't know that there's an evidence that they discriminated one way or the other. Whoever showed up on the trains, they would take care of. I'd like to think that was the case, but I can't say absolute certainty.
Thank you.
Yeah, fine.
So you mentioned there was a German treated. Were they POWs?
Yeah.
Can you talk about them?
They would have been casualties on the battlefield that would have been brought back, and they would have worked their way back through the different aid stations, field hospital, evacuation hospital, and then if they survived, they would have been brought back to the base hospital for treatment. So that, they, to my knowledge, they did not discriminate. A wounded soldier was a wounded soldier, so they would try to keep them alive as well as best they could.
Ren, were all of the medical facilities in the war run by university sectors?
Either universities or major hospitals. Those would have been the base hospitals, would have been by these units that were recruited from the major universities. Remember, this is only 7 years after the Flexner report, so you've kind of had a culling of medical schools per se. So the ones that were still active were basically at major universities and colleges, and so they would have been the ones that you could have selected for. And there's actually online resources where you can get a listing of all of the base hospitals. And I mentioned Virginia as being one, but there were certainly others from across the country. that were enlisted for the same purpose, to recruit physicians and nurses to staff these base hospitals.
You mentioned the number of soldiers that were cared for in the First World War by these units in the Second World War, but you didn't tell us the survival rate in the Second World War.
Well, I think probably we would probably venture. I can't give you an absolute number, but I think when we look at the advances in medicine from World War I to World War II, especially when it comes to the antibiotics, the penicillins and things like that, that enhance survivability. And what they learned from the First World War was able to be applied immediately in the Second World War. Transport, the use of antibiotics and penicillin, things of that nature for controlling infections. Certainly surgical techniques have been improved between the interwar period so that the survivability of major surgery would have been enhanced. So I think we could ascertain that survivability in World War II was higher than World War I. And I said, you can certainly look forward, you look ahead to the Vietnam War and so forth, where the mortality rate went down in each of those as the advances in medicine took place to cope with that. So I wish I could give you a specific number, but I don't have it at my fingertips. And in this crowd, I'm not going to make stuff up. I might do that in some crowds, but I won't try that too. There might be somebody who might be giving me a grade. Yeah.
I just wonder about the numbers you gave. For instance, 1,000 or so out of 10,000 or whatever, because there were so many infectious diseases that were spreading, not only in France where they were, but when they went back, they brought it to the US. So there's many more deaths due to infections.
Later, yes. And I mean, those statistics came right out of the unit history, which was published 2 years after the unit. So I'm relying on their statistics for the first person account, if you would. But certainly, I was astonished when you see the number of patients treated and only 102 deaths. I think in large part, in all likelihood, many of the patients that were going to died before they ever got there. Yes. They died in the evacuation hospitals. They died in the field hospitals. The ones that had, again, the triage system was likely to progress with those patients that were most likely to survive. So triaging those patients, those that made it to the base hospital, had a greater likelihood of survival because they'd survived the previous 3 tiers. They'd gotten to them. That's one way I can try to encapsulate in my mind how that mortality rate was so low. But you're right. I mean, I look at the ward scene of the influenza patients and I'm thinking, how did that work? How do you prevent the spread of the influenza virus when you've got open wards? Yes, ma'am.
We'll pass it back in just a second. I had a question about the horrors of the gas that was used in the war. And I'm not sure to what extent it killed immediately, but as I understand it, some survived and paid a terrible price over many, many years. What were they able to do to treat that or just otherwise keep people alive?
I think there were different, I mean, again, I'm not the expert, but there were different types of gas that were used, the chlorine gas. It depended upon how quickly you got your protective gear on. I think in many instances, the mustard gas, the chlorine gas, it affected the mucous membranes in the mouth and the eyes. And if you were transported to treatment early enough, they could wash out the eyes. And a lot of these men that were blinded, it was temporary. It wasn't permanent. But it took them off the battlefield for extended periods while they were treated. But some of the gas casualties were a temporary situation where through proper treatment and that sort of thing, they could recover from the gas. Not all of them, certainly. Yeah. Some of the things, if they got into the lungs, and then you likely could not survive. But if you put on your gas mask soon enough, or you got the word that there was gas and they get the gas mask on, then you might be more likely to be able to cope with and maybe only have a minor irritation from the gas. But from things I have seen and read, a lot of you see the pictures of the soldiers that were blinded, and that I had read that many of them, through proper treatment, would regain some or all of their eyesight at some point in time in the future.
Was it after the First World War that there was action taken to forbid gas warfare?
I think the Geneva Conventions came after the First World War. I mean, it still is astonishing to me in the brutality of World War II that neither side chose to use gas. I mean, why Hitler didn't use gas? Oh, he did use it, but not in the battlefield. But I think it was the fear of the repercussion of what that would entail. But, you know, during World War I, it was like, you know, anything goes. There were no rules of combat per se in the First World War. I think no one had ever seen a war on that scale before. And it's just astonishing to think how brutal it was. Yes, ma'am.
Do you have any statistics on the survival rate in other units in World War I?
That's a good question, and I did not research the other units. I would suspect, given the quality of the folks that they would have brought into their units, that Emory's not unique, that they probably had comparable survival rates. It might very well have depended upon where you were positioned in the rear and where the patients came from and the types of casualties. You know, it's conceivable that, you know, various parts of the battlefront might see more severe casualties than others, and how you got funneled from the front line to the base hospital might determine to some small degree the likelihood of survival. So, but I would envision that, you know, Emory's mortality rate is going to be comparable to Virginia's or Missouri's or Kansas or Illinois', whatever the base hospital might have been, because of the skill of the people in those units.
We had an ambulance.
You did buy an ambulance. So, but I would just think that would seem that it's wonderful to say they only had 102, and maybe that was, you know, a notch above everybody else, but I can't prove that. But I'd like to think that everybody was pretty much equal in terms of the quality of the care that they were delivering.
Noticing that statistic of 1,000+ casualties in flu epidemic in 1918. Of course, that was the year of the huge flu epidemic that claimed just multi-thousands.
Millions.
I wonder what relationship that had with those patients and that overall quantity of flu victims for that year.
I think, again, I'm not a CDC person, but I think 1918 was sort of the very beginnings of the flu epidemic. That it sort of reached its crescendo in 1919, and there's actually some studies that have suggested that the flu epidemic began at an Army military base in the American Midwest. And a lot of these soldiers took that with them when they went overseas and spread it over there. So it's possible that the scale of treatment and mortality from influenza in the base hospital might have been reflective of the early stages of the influenza epidemic worldwide. That many of these soldiers, they might have been treated and cured, but that didn't prevent what was going on in other hospitals and back here in the United States and of course across the world.
Thank you, that was great.
Thank you.
Were there other units from Georgia? I know MCG had a unit during World War II that was involved with the liberation of camps, for example.
In my research, I did not see, there was not a Medical College of Georgia unit that I'm aware of. I think what you might have seen was, if you look at the demographics of the physicians recruited into the Emory unit, they came from across Georgia. So it's quite possible that faculty and physicians from Augusta and from Savannah matriculated into the Emory unit to go overseas. I do not believe that in my research I saw any Medical College of Georgia unit that went overseas in the First World War. Certainly the scale of World War II saw a much broader, and at that point in time, World War II, there was a medical department in the military. So you had, a greater structure and ability to move forward more quickly. But as far as I know, the Emory unit was the only cohesive unit that came out of Georgia for the First World War.
Great. Elaine Feldman, who was on the faculty at MCG, has written a lot about that unit.
Okay. For World War II?
Yeah,
look for that.
work with the recovery of concentration camp survivors.
Oh, wow. Okay.
But my other question for you was what you just alluded to. What was the impact of this experience on the military medical corps?
Well, I think they recognized that to be prepared for the future, you had to have at least some skeletal structure in the military. I mean, we saw, obviously, World War II, they came back to the universities and said, organize units. So, but it was, I think, more integrated into the military infrastructure on its own. They weren't necessarily, differentiated by universities necessarily. You had more folks that were integrated into the mainstream military as surgeons and physicians versus necessarily being part of a university unit.
Just wondering, because I'm interested also not only humans but animals. Did the Americans have cavalries and use of horses to take their?
Certainly, probably only in a limited capacity. I think in World War I, World War I sort of convinced the military that the days of horses were numbered when you introduced the machine gun. You know, the cavalry charge was not going to be very successful in World War I. I think it was tried early in the war, and it was not a good idea, not in the face of tanks and machine guns. The machine gun really was one of the defining military tools of brutal slaughter in the First World War. Again, going back to trench warfare, when you go over the top to attack the other army's trench, and there's like 300 yards between the two trenches, and you've got enemy machine guns that are pre-positioned to mow you down. I mean, it was virtually suicidal to go over the top and try to take the other side's trench. I mean, you read stories of military battles where the front shifted 50 yards. You might lose 15,000 men, but you gain 50 yards. And then a week later, you lose those 50 yards. And that's kind of the way it went from 1914 to 1917, 1918. It was just a brutal, miserable way to fight a war. If there's any good way to fight a war, that was not it.
I would just say, and I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with the literature I'm familiar with, I see Liza nodding her head, the poetry and the prose, the novels and stories that came out of the First World War. But now to be able to see things like They Shall Not Grow Old, and I haven't seen 1917, but to experience it from that point of view. I have a question about your grandfather, actually, and I don't know if you ever got to know him, but your father undoubtedly did. And I wonder if he talked to your father about the experience or what he might have left behind that you were able to use by way of diaries or letters, that sort of thing.
I did not know him. He died in 1931. He died about a month before the hospital was rechartered as Crawford Long. He and Dr. Fisher had discussed that for an extended period, and they had decided to rename it in honor of Dr. Crawford Long. That was one of the last things he was able to do before he died. He came back from France in very poor health and was limited in his abilities subsequent to that for the next 10 years. My father was the sixth of his 8 children. So my father was a freshman at Emory when his father died. My oldest uncle, who was born in 1900, was 11 years older. And he actually entered medical practice with his father, with my grandfather, for a short period of time. They actually, if you've been down to Emory Midtown in the old part of the building, the 1911 building, on the right-hand side of the old lobby where the chaplain's office was for a long time. I think it's now maybe part of, I don't know if the chaplains are still there or whether it's, but that was where Dr. Davis and Dr. Shelley Davis had their practice for a period of time. But I never saw any letters that he wrote home. We had his microscope. My brother still had his microscope. And I have seen, references to him. And when I was doing the history of the hospital, I had the very good fortune to interview a woman who was in her 90s who had been a student nurse at the Davis Fisher Sanatorium when he was still practicing. He was near the end of his career in the mid-1920s. But he had 8 children. He had 5 daughters and 3 sons. So he had a big family. They lived on Spring Street. My father used to sneak into Georgia Tech football games right after the First World War. So he grew up a diehard Georgia Tech fan. None of his sons went to Tech. But our son did. I would love to have seen letters that he wrote. I don't know that if there were any, I never saw them. I had my father's letters home from the Pacific in World War II, which were fascinating to read from my perspective. But my grandfather's letters, no, I knew my grandmother. She lived to be in her mid-90s, but I never met him. I would love to have met him. He was a small man. I mean, Davis statures, and we're not tall, but I think he was about 5'5" or 5'6". But apparently he was quite a dynamo. And the student nurses, what this 94-year-old nurse told me was that the student nurses loved him because he had 5 daughters. And so he understood girls, and he understood hairstyles. There was a story one time, and Dr. John Henry can remember the story, that there was a student nurse that came in one day with bobbed hair, whatever that means. And Dr. Fisher expelled her on the spot, so that was inappropriate. So she went running to Dr. Davis crying, and Dr. Davis said, "Don't worry, you're not expelled. I'll take care of it." But I'd love to have known more about him, but I never got to meet him, unfortunately.
Ren, in terms of the professional development of nursing, what was happening in Europe at this time?
In Europe, in terms of education of nurses?
Well, in terms of the presence of nurses around the battlefield, the way we're thinking about this fairly new development in medicine.
I think, again, from my limited research, the profession of nursing was really blossoming as a profession unto itself in the years prior to and leading up to the First World War. The nursing schools, Davis Fisher Sanatorium had a school of nursing. Other hospitals, typically they were hospital-based schools of nursing in those days because it was a training ground for the staff. And so you would train your own nurses and then they would work for you. And then it evolved into university-based schools of nursing. So Emory University School of Nursing, Georgia Baptist had a school of nursing. Camille OBrien, interestingly enough, she trained at St. Joseph's School of Nursing. And in that video, you didn't see them, but there was a contingent of St. Joseph's School of Nursing alumni that were there to honor her. And according to Michael Hitt, the historian that you saw, he was dressed in the World War I uniform. He's a retired Roswell police officer. And he, as William Coffin said, he took the bone in his mouth and ran with it. When I met Michael Hitt, when we gave a variation of this talk for the Sandy Springs Historical Society as part of a 4-part lecture in the centennial of World War I met Michael. He had a 3-ring binder that thick on Camille OBrien. As I said, he had found her medical record from the hospital in France and found the letter that the superintendent of nurses had written in, about her dedication. She recited the fact that when she fell ill, she refused to have any of the physicians on staff to take care of her. She said, "They've got more important people to take care of than me." So she relied on the nurses to take care of her. And with the spinal meningitis, she succumbed in about 2 weeks to it, but she would not let doctors take care of her. So she was 34 years old, never married. As many women in the professions in those days, there was no time for marriage, and marriage was going to be the end of your career as a teacher or a nurse. But in answer to your question, Jamil, I think the structure and cohesion and comprehensiveness of nursing education, I think, really took off in the years following World War I. By the time you get to World War II, you've got very professional nurses that were going overseas, and you created the Cadet Nurse Corps, where you had nurses training. I think Crawford Long was having 2 classes a year, and we're doing World War II, to accelerate nurses training, to provide enough nurses both to send overseas, but also when the nurses went overseas, somebody had to fill their slot. So some of these young cadet nurses were trained to staff home front hospitals so that experienced nurses could then go overseas.
Did I see that there was a woman doctor?
Well, that reference, I made that quotation. I found her in my online
Her
research.
name was Crawford?
Mary, let me look her up real quick. I don't want to give you the wrong information.
I wrote down Mary Crawford and I wanted to.
It might be right. Was not related to Crawford Long that I know of. Where is she? Mary M. Crawford, MD. I'm not sure where she was from, but in my online research on the base hospitals, I found that quotation from her. And she reputedly was the only female physician to go overseas. I don't know who she was affiliated with, but it just, her quotation fits.
But she was in the Emory Unit.
No, she was not in the Emory
Oh,
Unit. No, no.
okay.
She was just a physician overseas, not in the Emory Unit. And in 2014, there was a celebration of the Emory units from World War I and World War II at the medical school library. And these were some of the artifacts that were on display. Dr. Davis's tunic and military uniform. There's his microscope that I used to play with when I was a kid. And in the back is the silk flag that was made for the Emory unit that flew over the base hospital in Blois. And it's now on display in the lobby of Emory Midtown. And then this portrait was commissioned of him by the unit veterans, and at the time he received an honorary degree from Emory in 1930, and they undertook to do this portrait. He died before it was finished, but it hangs somewhere in the Woodruff Healthcare Science Center Administration Building. They keep moving it, so I keep looking for it. Yeah. And then some other artifacts that were on display.